Okay, today is Thursday, February 10th, 2011, and this is Stephen Fagan, the Associate Curator at the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And the interview that we're doing today is part of the museum's ongoing oral history project. And today it's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Robert McClelland. Thank you so much for coming to the museum and sitting once again in front of our cameras, just as you did 10 years ago in July of 2001.
Thank you.
At the beginning of these, sir, just for the record, I would like to have you state your full name, date and place of birth, and just a little professional background about yourself.
All right. My name is Robert N. McClelland, MD, and I was born in East Texas, the little town of Gilmer, Texas, in 1929 on November the 20th. And I grew up there, went to college at the University of Texas in Austin, went to medical school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, and finished there with my MD degree in 1954. After that, I did my internship at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City, Kansas. And after that year, I went into the Air Force from 1955 through 1957 in Germany and served as a general medical officer in Trier and Bitburg, Germany. After that, I came to Dallas and began my surgery residency at Parkland Hospital in August of 1957. And I completed that in 1962. And after a year of practice in near the Amarillo, in a little town in the panhandle of Canyon, I came back to Dallas and started on the faculty in 1962, the surgical faculty at Southwestern Medical School. And I was on the faculty there from 1962 until I retired in 2007. And so that's what I've been doing during that entire period of my life.
Okay. I seem to recall reading that you came from a family of physicians. Is that why you chose to enter that career?
Well, I had several physicians in my family. My father was not a physician, but my grandfather was, and my uncle was, and my first cousin was. So I had, exposure to several physicians.
Was Dallas a natural place for you to end up since you came here some as a child?
Oh yeah, this was the big city to me, coming from a little town in East Texas. So I was here, visiting relatives from time to time fairly often.
Do you have any particular memories of the downtown area growing up, what you recall?
Oh yeah, I mean it was a magic place to, again, a fellow from a little town over there. And of course it was Main, Elm, Commerce, and Pacific. That was where it was at, so to speak. Then there was really, at that time, in the mid-30s, I don't think any outlying areas where there were shopping centers. I guess the Miracle Mile in Lover's Lane after the war was the first one of those. But up until the time after the war, everything was downtown. It was very exciting to a little kid, and watching the streetcars go up and down and riding on them, that was very exciting.
Did you have the chance to visit the old Parkland Hospital before it became Woodlawn?
I didn't. My wife did. My wife came here in 1952, right out of nurse's training, and worked at the old Parkland on the polio wards, where they had all iron lungs and whatnot. And she said from time to time power would go out, and they'd have to page people from all over the hospital to come help work the iron lungs by hand until the power came back on. So that was my sort of secondary contact through her with the old Parkland. But when I came here, the new Parkland had opened in 1954, and I came here in 57 to start my residency.
Tell me a little bit about Parkland in those days, the size of the staff and the technology and equipment that you had at your disposal.
When I started in my residency, Dr. Tom Shires was the chief of surgery, or rather was one of the professors of surgery. He later became chief. Dr. Ben Wilson was the chief, and Dr. Jerry Sturman was the only other member of the surgical faculty. The school was much, much smaller at that time. Someone told me recently that at that time there were, in addition to Parkland, there were 3 other buildings on the campus, and it was just a few acres. Now, someone told me that there are 88 buildings, and there's over a section of land that is includes the campus. So it's grown tremendously in the last 50 to 60 years from what it was back then.
Working at Parkland in the late 50s, early 60s, were you aware of the atmosphere in Dallas politically and socially at that time?
Pretty much. I think it was hard to ignore it, that there was a very much of a conservative, or you might say far right-wing element in society here that was the most vocal. I don't know that they were a majority, but they were certainly the most vocal. This was in the days of the Birch Society, and just before the assassination, I think this was brought out by the fact that Stevenson had visited here, and he was a Democratic candidate for presidency at that time, and he had been accosted by a crowd of people who were anything but favorable to him, and one of them spit at him, and someone hit him in the head with a sign, and so that was sort of the background right before President Kennedy came here in 1962.
Was Parkland desegregated by the time of the assassination?
No, it didn't get desegregated until, it must have been in the late 60s, perhaps into the early 70s, but I'm not completely clear on that, but I think it was in the late 60s before it was desegregated.
Were facilities and the treatment for African Americans, was it different than those that were offered to the whites?
No, I would say that except for the fact that they were segregated in the hospital, management and treatment was pretty much the same as for white patients.
Okay. And the only African Americans on staff at Parkland would have been orderlies and people like that at that time?
That's right. There was a little while after I joined the faculty, there was a black surgeon here who finally was admitted to the staff, although he really never had anything but a peripheral position. He used to come to grand rounds and make appearances, but he was not really a part of the ongoing staff activities.
Do you remember his name by any chance?
As I recall, his name was Mason, if I'm not incorrect in remembering that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I understand you were not a Kennedy supporter.
No, but I wasn't against him. I was really, I think, what you'd call apolitical. I had other concerns than politics or anything associated with it at that time. But, I was not particularly for him or against him, really. I just didn't think about that much at all at that time, nor, for that matter, a little bit more now, but not that much more.
A lot happened during his brief time in the White House in terms of dealings with Cuba and Russia and the space race.
Oh, yeah.
What stands out in your mind from the Kennedy presidency?
Oh, the greatest thing, of course, was the missile crisis. And at that time, I was in the last year of my residency. And we were living off of Gaston Avenue in a rental house, my wife and I at the time. And she was working part-time as a nurse, and I was in the last year of my residency at that time when the missile crisis developed. And I remember everybody was really very concerned and very gratified when we saw on television those Soviet boats turn around and start going back toward Russia after having been headed toward Cuba with more missiles at the time of the crisis. So I was acutely aware, as everybody was in the country, because we were thinking that there was an imminent chance of the final confrontation with nuclear weapons at that time.
Did you and your wife have a plan in place, what you would do in case
We
of
talked
that?
about it. In fact, we even looked out in the backyard of our rental house because people were digging shelters. We didn't have enough money, and of course it wasn't our house, but we talked about, gee, you could put a place out here in the backyard, and this is where we could maybe get some shelter, but that's about as far as it got at that. But there were people actually building shelters here in this area, to my knowledge.
Now, I know you had the chance to actually see President Kennedy in person. Would you tell me that story?
Right. That's an odd coincidence of several odd coincidences in my connection with this. When I was, again, in my senior year of my residency, my wife was working part-time at Baylor, And at that time, she happened to be working on the floor where Mr. Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, had been admitted for treatment of a pancreatic cancer by Dr. Jesse Thompson, one of the surgeons here in town who was a friend of mine. And my wife was helping take care of Mr. Sam. And he had a stroke, Mr. Sam did, as well as having his problem with his pancreatic cancer. And one day she called me during the time that she was taking care of him, or helping take care of Mr. Sam, and told me that she had forgotten to pick up her check at the hospital that day. And would I mind on my way home, and as I said, we lived just off Gaston Avenue at that time, but I normally never went to Baylor. I was tied up at Parkland all the time. But she asked me to go by Baylor and pick up her check, and so I left work a little early that day and went over to Baylor and parked my car at a parking lot across from Baylor Hospital, which was much smaller at that time, and was walking across Gaston Avenue toward the hospital, and there was a side entrance at that time that's no longer there. And I was heading for that side entrance to go into where I knew the office was to pick up her check. And as I did, walked across Gaston, I looked over to my left, and turning off of Washington Street onto Gaston were 3 or 4 motorcycle cops leading 3 long black limousines down Gaston Avenue, and they turned and went up toward this side entrance just as I was approaching the side entrance, and the motorcade and I reached the side entrance at the same time. And I found myself standing at the curb behind the rear door, right at the rear door of the lead limousine, and one of the motorcycle policemen got off his motorbike, came back and politely asked me to step back out of the way so he could open the rear door. I was standing immediately by it, and I did, and he opened the rear door, and I was astonished to see President Kennedy step out of the limousine and bound up the stairs into the side entrance of the hospital, and he had flown down here especially to see Mr. Sam that day. And so I got home that evening. My wife asked me, she said, she yelled from the kitchen, "Did you think to pick up my check?" And I said, "Yes." And guess what else? I said, "I picked up your check, and as I was there, I told her what happened. I saw President Kennedy." Oh, so that was an odd coincidence, and I later thought about what are the chances that I would have seen him 2 years later, as well as just happening to be there, where I could have literally leaned over and touched him on the back as he walked by me.
Did Kennedy look the same in person as he appeared in Life magazine?
Yes, he did. And of course, I got a brief glimpse of him as he bounded by me, as I said, and up the steps into the side entrance. So I didn't get to study him very closely, but I saw that's who it was.
Parkland has been described as a major trauma center at the time of the assassination. Was it actually known as a major trauma center prior to the shooting?
No, I would say Parkland was essentially unknown nationally, and maybe even to some extent, in the area away from Dallas. But it became very well known, of course, immediately after November the 22nd. And then it developed into, not because of that, but it was on its way to developing as a trauma center, because trauma was really just beginning to be identified as a problem, because we were not yet into the Vietnam War as much as we would be, but we were getting into it. And people were beginning to become aware that there were, even that early, or certainly within a year or two after that, there were beginning to be casualties out of Vietnam. And so there was a large interest in trauma beginning to develop. And Dr. Shires, our chief of surgery at that time, was basically a trauma specialist. That was what he took as sort of his area of interest because of his position at Southwestern and at Parkland, where we took care of so many trauma patients. That's why he became a nationally recognized expert in that area soon after.
Can you give me a snapshot of what your day-to-day routine would be in 1963?
In 1963, I was in the second year on the faculty at Southwestern, and I was generally just teaching residents in the operating room, making rounds with residents, helping train residents do surgery. And we had medical students who were attached to our individual surgical services. And so we took part in the teaching of medical students, sort of on-the-job training, if you will. And that was my principal activity. I often tell people that, well, I'm a professor of surgery, and they sort of think, oh, I'm standing in a classroom at a blackboard teaching people how to. That's not the way it is. It's a matter of standing at an operating table and showing people how to do surgical procedures. So that was my day-to-day activity, and much of that was operating on trauma patients as well as elective surgery patients, along with the residents and the interns at Parkland who were associated with the students at Southwestern who were also attached to our services.
Would this on-the-job training ever take place in the actual emergency room, in the trauma room?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, we'd be called down to see patients just like we were to see President Kennedy and initiate their care there. Usually that was the very first initiation of the care was by the interns and the students and the residents who were assigned, at full time in the emergency room. But then the faculty often got called down to see patients as they were in the process of being readied for surgery or admission to the hospital.
Are you aware of any advance visits by the Secret Service or any officials in case the president needed to come to Parkland?
No, we did, as I recall. Someone told me that they had asked, I can't remember who it was, but they had asked some of the Secret Service men why they had brought the president to Parkland. And I was told that what the Secret Service men told this person who then told me about that whenever the president went anywhere, they would usually see where the nearest hospitals were, and they generally preferred to identify the hospital that was associated with the medical school, wherever the city was that the president was visiting, as the hospital where they might go if they had the need to go there. And so they had apparently thought about that they might come to Parkland because it was associated as a teaching hospital with Southwestern Medical School. So that was what we were told about that.
Earlier we talked a little bit about the political atmosphere in Dallas. Do you remember any conversations or any comments that anyone made about the president's visit and whether there might be a demonstration?
Not really. We knew the president was coming to town, and we knew that there was a sort of a bad atmosphere, you might say. And in fact, in one of the papers, I can't remember whether it was the Times Herald or the Dallas News, someone had taken out a full-page ad accusing President Kennedy of treason and saying that he should be tried as a traitor. And there was a full-page ad. I remember seeing that in the Dallas paper a day or two before the president came. So there was a very ugly atmosphere, I would say. And of course, Dallas was, I think, inappropriately, in my opinion, although understandably, labeled as the city of hate after the president was assassinated here.
But ahead of time, you weren't personally concerned for the president's safety?
No. We knew he was here, and we knew there was this ugly atmosphere, but we were as dismayed and surprised as anybody when we heard about what happened.
I think the best thing to do now is for you to just walk me through what you remember November 22nd, and I can follow up with questions at the end.
All right. On November the 22nd, I was in the operating room at Parkland, and I was showing a film of how to repair a hiatus hernia in one of the conference rooms there in the operating room to some of the surgery residents. And I heard a little tap on the door of the conference room, and I went to the door and looked out, and Dr. Crenshaw, Chuck Crenshaw, who later wrote a book about his experiences with some comment being made about that later, but he was standing there and he asked me to step outside, that he needed to tell me something, and so I did. And when I did, he said that they had just told him that they had called the emergency room and that President Kennedy had been shot during his motorcade downtown, and they were bringing him at that moment to the emergency room, and that they had called and said that they should page all of the surgery faculty to come to the emergency room immediately. And so he was telling me that. And so he and I got on the elevator next to the nurses station there in the operating room, and went down 2 floors directly to the emergency room. And while we were riding down in the elevator, I tried to reassure myself and Dr. Crenshaw by saying, well, Chuck, you know, we often get these tales about what they're bringing into the emergency room. It turns out not to be nearly as bad as they said. And so with that, the door opens of the elevator, and we walk around a little angle and walk out into an area we call the pit, which was a big area, about 50 feet on each side. And around that were all of the patient cubicles where emergency patients were seen. And extending off of that big pit area were the 4 trauma rooms where we took patients in for resuscitation and actually even some minor surgery sometime who had been brought in with injuries and whatnot to the emergency room. There was trauma room 1 and 2 on the right side, and trauma room 1 and 2 on the left and the right side, and trauma room 3 and 4 just adjacent to that off of this hallway, which was immediately adjacent to the pit. So that's what we walked out into. And that pit area was jammed with men in business suits, all of them wearing, as everybody did, hats back in that. So I thought, I'd never seen a crowd like that in this area. And as I thought that, the crowd spontaneously parted, and I could see through that crowd of people, the corridor through the crowd of people, sitting near the entrance to Trauma Room 1 on a folding chair was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing. And I thought to myself, my God, it really did happen. It's not just a story that's been exaggerated. And so I thought immediately also at that time that I knew Dr. Shires, my chief of surgery, was in Galveston at a meeting of Western Surgical Society, so he was not here. And I thought, well, where are Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter? It was about noon, and I immediately thought more than likely they were somewhere along Harry Hines at one of the hamburger joints, as we often went out to get a hamburger, and that's what they were doing. And I was the only surgical faculty here. I had had my 34th birthday 2 days before that, so I was a very young, very wet behind the ears surgeon, you might say. And I literally had to almost force myself to walk back toward Trauma Room 1 where Mrs. Kennedy was. And as I walked back and entered that area where the trauma rooms were, Doris Nelson, who was the nurse in charge of the emergency room, was standing there between 2 Secret Service men, or at least I assume that's who they were, and she was telling them who not to let by or who to let by, and she motioned that I should be allowed to go by. And I went by Mrs. Kennedy and pushed the door open to Trauma Room 1, and the first thing that I was horrified by was President Kennedy's bloody head and face, which was being lit up by a surgical lamp that was shining on him. And I was also, at the same time I was horrified, I was gratified to see that Dr. Baxter and Dr. Perry had just preceded me into the room, and so that I was not alone. And Dr. Jenkins, in fact, our anesthesiology professor, had just arrived with an anesthesia machine because he had gotten the word about what was going on in the emergency room. And so that's what I walked into. And as I arrived, Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter were just placing a surgical drape over the president's neck to explore a little wound that I didn't see, but that Dr. Perry told me about as I walked by on the left side of the gurney where the president was lying. He said, Bob, there's a little wound here near where his tie, the president's tie, had been. Now, he had been cut out of his clothing at that time. But anyway, they described a small wound that was probably about 1/4 of an inch in size just to the right of his windpipe, low in his neck, just above where the clavicle, the collarbone, joins the sternum. And they thought initially that this might have been an entrance wound. We knew nothing about the circumstances at that time. And he said, we're exploring that wound because that's right near where some of the major vessels are. Now they just began, people said, well, didn't you all think that he was probably dead anyway? And I've often usually reply to that, you don't think in those circumstances, you begin to react appropriately, you hope. But you move. You don't stand around, scratching your head about what am I going to do. You react, or you may lose the opportunity to do what you need to do to save a life. So that's what they were doing, and they had just made an incision across the neck that included this little opening. So they saw it, but I didn't see it, but they clearly described it to me. Dr. Perry handed me a little retractor, a so-called Army-Navy retractor, and said, Bob, would you go and stand at the head of the gurney and hold this retractor in this incision we've made so we can see what we're doing better. So I did, and I walked around and stood by Dr. Jenkins, who was sitting on a stool at the head of the gurney, working the anesthesia machine and controlling the president's respirations. He had good cardiac activity. He was attached by this time to an electrocardiographic monitor that was right there by the gurney. And Dr. Clark, our neurosurgery professor, had come in and was standing there by the ECG monitor and sort of monitoring that and monitoring what Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter and I were doing to explore this wound. And that put me in a position where I was about probably 18 inches directly behind and above the president's head wound. And that allowed me to see that he had a massive wound far in the back of his head. Some people have said, well, I couldn't have seen that. Well, I saw it, and the head was positioned so that I could see that wound and actually look down inside what we call the middle cranial fossa, where the back half of his cerebrum had been blown out when the bullet struck him in the head, so that the right posterior or back portion of the brain was completely, of the cerebrum, was completely gone, blasted out through that hole that was probably difficult to identify the size completely because there was blood and hair all around it. But it was conservatively, I would say, 4 to 5 inches in diameter and included not just the back of the top of the head, but far back. A little farther back, I think, than the pictures drawn in the Warren Commission drawings show, where they're indicating that the bullet came from above, from the book depository, and entered the back top part of the head. I think it was in the back part of the head that this large wound was involved. And as I stood there looking into that empty part of the skull, the right portion of the cerebellum fell out onto the gurney in front of me. And I remember vividly, of course, seeing that and thinking that that was the cerebellum, which has a very characteristic gray appearance with different sorts of markings and striations on it than the cerebrum does. But most of the cerebrum in that part of the head was gone anyway. Dr. Jenkins also, in his initial Warren Commission testimony, said that he had seen the cerebellum, the right half of it, fall out. But he later changed his testimony because someone apparently told him, oh no, you could not have seen the cerebellum. That was cerebrum, wasn't it? Well, yeah, maybe it was. I guess it was the cerebrum. Dr. Jenkins and I had several good-natured arguments about that, but I have no doubt whatsoever that that was cerebellum. The reason that's an important point to make as opposed to cerebrum is that this would have required a rather far posterior placement in the far back of the head rather than further forward for the cerebellum to have been able to fall out in the way it did, which was just to readily drop out through that large opening onto the gurney. And then that, in my mind, as I'll maybe point out later, means that the bullet probably took a horizontal course rather than a tangential course from the school book depository, that it very likely took a horizontal course from a bullet fired from the picket fence on the grassy knoll. So that's kind of where I am on that day with that wound.
We'll talk a little bit more about the medical evidence and the controversy surrounding it later,
Right.
But take me through the rest of the procedure in Trauma 1 until
Okay.
the body left Parkland.
As they finished this exploration, which was probably about 10 minutes, and had put the tracheostomy tube in where they had done the exploration. Dr. Clark, who was standing by the ECG monitor, just as they finished up, he looked at the monitor and saw that it had flat-lined, that there was no cardiac activity. And he said to Malcolm, he said, "Mac," he said, "you can stop now because he's gone." And with that, Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter stepped away from the gurney. Dr. Perry, along with everybody else in the room except Dr. Baxter, who was on the other side of the gurney, and I, as the rest of the doctors were leaving the room, they pushed the gurney against the wall of Trauma Room 1 and sort of trapped Dr. Baxter and I against the wall of the gurney. And so after everybody else though left, we were about to push the gurney back so we could walk around and leave too. Everybody else was gone. But just as we began to do that, the door came open to Trauma Room 1 and a priest came in. Father Huber, we later learned, and we would have had to sort of almost knock him down to get out of the room. And so we just froze again against the wall of the trauma room, and he came in and administered the last rites to the president. He uncovered the president's head, and so Dr. Baxter and I were standing there right next to that. And I heard Father Huber say, as he leaned over the president's head after anointing his forehead, he said, "If thou livest." And then I couldn't hear anything else that he said because it was in a low voice. And after he completed that, just as he was completing that and putting everything that he had out into his little bag that he had with him, Mrs. Kennedy came back into the room. She had come in and out of the room several times during the time of the exploration of the president's neck wound, and Dr. Clark had gently ushered her out of the room each time she came in. But now she came back in, and she stood by the president's head and asked Father Huber. I couldn't hear what she said because she was speaking in such a low voice, but she, from the context of his answer, she apparently asked him if he had received last rites. And he said to her in a voice that I could clearly hear, "Yes, I've given him conditional absolution." Those are his exact words, I remember. And with that, she was obviously dismayed. She grimaced, but she didn't say anything. And she stood there for a moment, and then there was a ring exchange from her finger to his finger, and then she exchanged rings between, and I can't remember how that went, because that's one of the things that's, for some reason, is not clear. Everything else is emblazoned in my mind, but I know that there was some kind of ring exchange that she made at that time. And she then stood there for a moment, walked to the end of the gurney where the president's bare right foot was protruding from the sheet, and she leaned over and kissed his right foot and then walked out of the room. And that's the last that I saw of her. And then Dr. Baxter and I left immediately after that. And I didn't see anything more of them. What I heard later was from Dr. Rose, our forensic pathologist, who confronted them as they were removing the president from the hospital. They had placed him into a coffin, apparently in Trauma Room 1. I had never known until recently where he had been when they transferred him into the coffin, but I talked to the Mr. Aubrey, what was his name, Rilke?
Oh, Aubrey Reich. Yeah.
Aubrey Reich, yeah. And he said that he had brought the coffin out and that they had placed the president into the coffin, with the coffin being on the gurney, in Trauma Room 1. Now, I had always thought before that maybe he had been transferred to the pathology department, but that was not the case when I talked to him. Well, he's dead now, but I talked to him about 2 years ago when we were both speaking somewhere about this. And anyway, they were walking out of Parkland, and Dr. Rose stepped out, stopped them, and informed them that state law was that they needed to perform an autopsy on anybody who had been murdered in the state. I later learned that at that time there was no federal law against assassinating a president. There is now, but there was not at that time. Well, this group that was accompanying the president on the gurney in his coffin, followed along the left side of the coffin by Mrs. Kennedy and several other people, was being headed up by two Secret Service men, Dr. Rose said, one of whom was carrying a Thompson submachine gun, and the other one was unencumbered. And the unencumbered one, when Dr. Rose stopped him, looked at Dr. Rose, walked over to him standing kind of off to one side in the corridor that they were in, put his hands under his armpits, lifted him off the ground and set him over against the wall, didn't say anything to him, shook his finger in his face, and turned, went back to the gurney, and they proceeded on out to the ambulance and to Air Force One with the president's body. Now that was Dr. Rose's description of that to me, not my direct observation.
Let's go back to Trauma Room 1 for a moment. You mentioned Dr. Baxter and Dr. Perry. Can you tell me who else you remember seeing that day in that room?
I don't, except for those, I don't, there were a lot of people in and out of the room.
Okay.
But I can't say that I saw any of the others. I know from, hearing about who was in there. There was Dr. Richard Delaney, one of the residents in urology. Of course, Dr. Peters was there, Dr. Ron Jones was there, and they were starting IVs and actually put a chest tube in. Dr. Selden, I think, a professor of medicine, was there. Dr. Bashur, one of the cardiologists, was there. And Dr. Salyer, one of the interns, was there. Those are the only ones whose names that I remember as having heard that they were there. I don't remember seeing any of them. I may have seen them, but I was so concentrating on where we were and what we were doing that I probably don't recollect the ones that I saw and the ones that I just heard about.
A few years ago, a neurologist, Dr. Robert Grossman, came forward and said he was in the room.
Right, he was. I've neglected to mention that. I knew he was. He was in the room.
He indicated that he had ample time to examine the president's head wound.
That's not right.
Okay.
That is not right. Because the president had just gotten in there when I came. There was no one else around there. I was directly above the president, so he was not. If he saw it, it would be kind of from an angle somewhere. He didn't look down into it like I was able to do for that long period of time, for that short distance. He may have seen it.
Do you remember a Dr. Robert Walker?
Oh yeah, he's our oral surgeon. He may have been in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now across the hall in Trauma 2, Governor Connolly was being treated at this
Right.
time.
He was being treated by Dr. Robert Shaw, who is our professor of thoracic surgery, and Dr. James Duke, Jimmy Red Duke, we call him, who is on the faculty, in fact, at the University of Texas Medical School in Houston, another trauma surgeon down there, and a very colorful character.
It sounds like it was a very chaotic situation. I've seen pictures of Trauma 1, and it's a very small room, and to imagine 12 or 13 physicians crammed in there. Was it a chaotic situation?
Oh yes, it was. It was very chaotic, and it was jammed full of people. The ones that I named, and maybe some others that I was unaware of.
Standing so close to the president's head and seeing his face, did you ever stop being a surgeon for a moment and think about the historical significance of what was right in front of you?
No, not until later. And it was soon after that. When we did leave the room, we went back up to the operating room and sat down near the nurses' station where there was a coffee pot. Dr. Perry, Dr. Baxter, Dr. Bashur, and Dr. Peters, and several other people. And we sort of looked at one another like, did this really happen? That was the first time that it registered on us rather than us just reacting to it. And that before we had time to think about it, that was the first time that we thought about it. And it was just like you had been in a nightmare. And that one of those things you can really hardly believe that you were directly involved in. That was our immediate feeling, I think, of all of us. And as we sat there, two Secret Service men came by with pads of progress notes that they had gotten from one of the nurses station and asked us, handed each one of us a pad of these notes and asked us to write down our immediate impressions of what we saw and did in Trauma Room 1, which we all sat there and wrote out, and then they took them back up from us, and those have been reproduced in the New York Times abbreviated version of the Warren Commission. You can find those things that we wrote out that day.
If an individual with a comparable wound that the president had come into the emergency room at that time in 1963, if he wasn't the president, would the same resuscitative efforts have been performed, you think?
Probably so. And people have asked, well, is there any way with what we know now that he could have survived? No. He had an absolutely fatal head wound and brain injury that nobody could survive then or now. But again, that was not really thought about at the time, that he was, that, well, there's no point in doing anything. He's going to die anyway. All you do is you start reacting, and Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter reacted to this wound in the neck.
Were you aware of any confrontations between law enforcement officials out in the emergency room during the president's treatment?
I wasn't, no.
Did you hear about any later?
Not really. I heard that Lyndon Johnson had been put aside in one of the patient cubicles and was being accompanied by some Secret Service agents, but that was the only thing I heard about any activity out in the emergency room area near where we were.
You never saw Vice President Johnson?
Never saw him.
Okay. Now, as you mentioned, of course, the medical evidence is extremely controversial, and I appreciate you going into so much detail as to what you observed that day in Trauma 1. Let's go forward a little bit. Can you tell me when you first became aware that the placement of the president's wounds would be a subject of intense discussion and scrutiny?
I suppose that would be not at that time, because as I said, at that time we didn't know anything about the circumstances in Dealey Plaza here. But when I first saw the Zapruder film, and that was not until several years later, I came home one evening from operating at Parkland, and my wife was watching Johnny Carson. And as I came in, she said, "Oh, come in here quick, because Geraldo Rivera is a guest on the Carson show tonight, and he says that he has a copy of the film of the president's assassination, and is going to show it here in a minute." And so I ran in and sat down beside her just as they were about to show the Zapruder film, and they first showed it in regular speed, and then they showed it in very slow motion. And when I saw the film, it became apparent on just the regular motion film that as the motorcade came onto Elm Street, immediately after that, the president raised his hands to his neck like that, with his elbows out like that, as though something had happened. And he clearly was distressed by this. And then the motorcade slowly proceeds on down toward the triple underpass and disappears behind a sign along the side of Elm Street there. And several seconds later comes out from behind the sign, and 1 or 2 seconds after that, Mrs. Kennedy is leaning over toward the president, and he still has his arms up to his neck. And then, a second or two after emerging from behind the sign, his head literally explodes, and he's thrown violently backward and to the left, as you might imagine if you were struck by a missile coming from the grassy knoll. Although some people, in fact, Dr. Latham, I believe was his name, did a lot of studies, and he contended that this was the jet effect of the brain blowing the body backward, and I have always found that very difficult to believe. And it seemed to me then that he was being thrown backward. And then I thought, well, maybe that's because the motorcade is suddenly speeding up. And then they ran the movie in very slow motion with the numbered frames, and that's not what happened. his body is thrown violently backward and to the left several frames before the car obviously then begins to accelerate toward the triple underpass. So it was clear that it wasn't the acceleration of the car, it was the force of the missile that had driven him back to the left and backwards.
What you observed on that film was the same as what you saw in Trauma 1, you think?
Well, the thought began to occur to me then that, that there were maybe two shooters for the first time. And that this was, in my mind, consistent with the fact that you would have a bullet coming from the grassy knoll, from the picket fence, that would enter perhaps somewhere up near the hairline. We didn't see anything there because his head he had a lot of hair and there was blood everywhere. But I saw this wound in the back very clearly. And so it seemed to me that probably a bullet striking somewhere near the hairline or just behind it and coursing transversely across the skull and out the far back of the head. And the president was leaning over a little bit at that time when that bullet struck him from having been hit from behind. And I think that bullet, that wound that we saw in the neck, was from the back and was an exit wound from the bullet that probably was fired from the 6th floor of the depository building. That there was a shooter there. Whether that was Oswald or not, there's been a lot of contention about that.
Do you have any thoughts on whether that was the same bullet that then wounded Governor Connolly?
No, I don't think that was the case at all. The magic bullet theory, I think, doesn't hold water really at all. I can't really explain Governor Connolly's wound. That's beyond me. I don't have enough observations about that to explain that.
Now, the autopsy photographs have become a point of contention among researchers, and they don't necessarily match up with the initial impressions that the staff at Parkland had. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes, they took us, I think 5 of us, separately, or at least we were brought in to see the pictures separately. In 1988, we were flown to Washington and taken to the National Archives building where we were shown 8x10 color glossies of the postmortem pictures. And the wounds, to me, that they showed us looked pretty much this big wound I saw, but then they showed us another picture where looked like a flap of scalp was being pulled up by the prosector, the person who did the autopsy, seemed to be pulling a flap of loose scalp up over this hole that I had seen in the back of the head. But then I was later told, someone told me, oh no, that was not a flap of scalp, that was just the way the intact scalp looked. And I told him, I said, well, no, that's not what I saw. That what I saw was this wound far back in the back of the head.
Some of those pictures are reproduced in that bottom book there on the table. Would you mind pulling that up and we can look at some of those on camera? That bottom book that I had.
Oh, the bottom book that
yes,
you
sir.
have here, yeah.
On page 80 of that book, that's, for those watching the video, that's The Killing of the President by Robert Roden.
Mm-hmm.
Around page 80, we have some of the color autopsy photographs. I thought
Right.
you might want to
Yeah.
show those and tell me what.
Right. Well, now, this would be consistent where my thumb is. This hole far back in the back of the head would be consistent with what I saw. I didn't see that because this was just hair and blood up here. But I clearly saw this, and it looked pretty much like that. And of course, that's like my drawing. I drew that for Josiah Thompson, I think about 2 or 3 years after the assassination, when he was researching his book 6 Seconds in Dallas. So that was, and one of the things that mystified me later was some x-ray picture showing a lot of damage to the right orbit of the eye. Well, there was nothing like that, but one of the official pictures of one of the skull films showed that. And this is the picture that I'm talking about of the flap of scalp And here you can see more clearly than in some of the pictures that the pathologist who did the postmortem seems to be pulling a flap of scalp forward, and apparently that was done ostensibly to show a bullet wound somewhere here in the flap of scalp. I can't see that really on this picture, but that's what I was referring to when I commented about a flap of scalp, because clearly that doesn't show this. But I know that that was there.
Did seeing those autopsy photos in 1988 change your story at all as far as what you observed that day?
Well, that thing about the flap was confusing. The rest of it was pretty much what we had seen. So it didn't really, from that standpoint, the whole thing didn't change my thinking. But I was mystified, particularly by the later comment of someone telling me that no, that was not a flap of scalp, that was just that the head was intact in that area. Well, that's not true.
Now, we're here in 2011, we're almost 25 years removed from when you first saw those autopsy photos. Where are you today in terms of what you think happened to the president that day?
Well, what I think happened, and this is again a worm's eye view of it, not any kind of authoritative, I know the answer, because I don't any more than I think anybody else does. But I have my thoughts about what I think may have happened. And what I think may have happened is that, as I said in describing the Zapruder film, I think the president was first struck by a bullet in his back that came out this little hole in his neck. Now people will say, well, yes, but aren't exit wounds large holes? No, that's only if they're in bone and a high-powered missile, hit something like, then it would blow out a big piece of bone. But it wouldn't necessarily do that in soft tissue like here. It would very readily penetrate and just leave a small hole. And then I noticed on the page before this, there's some trajectories of that bullet wound there and how it might have come out the neck. I think I read somewhere that the president's coat was hunched up over his neck more. So I think probably the trajectory would have been more at an angle like this than like that. But that's just my thought about it, whether that's true or not. But I'm reasonably certain from the Zapruder film that he was first hit in the back. And in fact, in this book that I brought in here, this Legacy of Secrecy, this is based, are you familiar with that book?
I don't think so.
It's a good book. I'm a little bit uncertain about certain parts of it, but mostly I think it's pretty authoritative because it's based on records that were released from the National Archives rather than just somebody's opinion. It's direct quotes from these public records that are available for anybody. And there are several people quoted in here who clearly believe that the bullet that killed the president, the major head wound, was fired from the picket fence. But one of the people quoted in here was a Secret Service agent, I think his name was Landis, who was riding in the limousine behind the president's limousine, and he said he saw the president first. He thought he had been hit in the back because he saw, as he stated, a nick appeared in his coat. And so I think that's probably when the bullet was fired from somewhere from behind and above, whether it was the sixth floor of the book depository, could have been, or it could have been from any one of the buildings around there. But that bullet hit him first, and the reaction to that bullet is shown in the Zapruder film, and I think it came out his neck, and that's what the president was reaching for in the Zapruder film, is that pain that he felt in his neck there. And then he rode forward several seconds longer, and then the shooter from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And then I've got several thoughts that have developed about witnesses who saw people, different witnesses who saw people behind the picket fence. And you may want to or not questioned me about that.
Sure, I'd like to. Let me just pause real quick. And before we get away from those autopsy photos, there have been a number of theories suggested over the years trying to explain the discrepancies between the observations at Parkland and the observations at Bethesda. David Lifton, of course, came forward with a theory that suggests surgical alteration of the president's remains. Robert Groden believes that that the autopsy pictures were altered in some way. Is there a particular theory that you subscribe to?
I don't have one. I don't know. I know there are questions, but I don't have a clear enough thought to counter that with one of my, well, I think this happened. I don't know enough about it. I'm not clear enough in my mind to make a statement about that. But I will, on the other hand, say that I'm pretty clear in my mind about where the neck wound came from behind and above, and that the wound that blew his head apart came from the front, from the grassy knoll. That's where I have my firmest opinions.
Well, you are an exception among the doctors at Parkland because you have actually followed this subject over the years and you stay current with most of the literature and the theories.
I've kind of had to, because different people down through the years, in fact, particularly in this last year, I have been asked to speak about this in all kinds of venues. I've spoken at the Dallas Public Library twice in the last year and a half because they asked me to come down to a little thing they have in the evening and speak. I've spoken to the Park City's Historical Foundation at the old Parkland Hospital earlier in this year, and various people, and to one of the people in my neighborhood when I was out on a walk one day asked me if I would come and speak to some of his neighbors at his house one night. I said, well, yeah, okay. And in fact, I got a very interesting piece of information from that talk. A direct quote from Dr. Connolly, from Governor, excuse me, I'll get my terms right, from Governor Connolly, that was told to me by my neighbor's neighbor, who said he had been at a cocktail party many years ago with Governor Connolly, and they had been talking with a little group there, as people do at these very large cocktail parties. He didn't say where it was. And Mrs. Connolly left their little group and went clear across the room and joined another little group and chatted with them for a few minutes and then came back and rejoined them. And at that time, Governor Connolly stopped what he was saying to their little group and leaned down to Nellie and said, "Nellie, do you know who you were talking to?" And she said, "No, I don't." Said, "You were talking to Carlos Marcello, the man who nearly killed me." Carlos Marcello being the head of the mafia in New Orleans. And that was a direct quote by somebody who heard Governor Connolly say that, who was a neighbor of this neighbor of mine.
Wow. And was there any idea as to what time period this took place?
It was a long time ago, many years ago. He didn't tell me, and I didn't ask him what year that was, but it was quite some time.
Do you get tired of talking about this subject?
A little bit, but I understand, people wanting to hear about it, and okay,
You mentioned to me on our way to this room today that you're the last of the principal physicians that really participated in the resuscitation efforts.
Right.
Do you, as a result of that, feel the burden of history?
Not really. It's just kind of, well, that's the way it is, okay, so,
Well, I know you had more to do with this subject than just the treatment of the president November 22nd. You were also involved on Sunday when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot.
Right.
Will you walk me through that, please?
Yes. What happened there, Saturday went by, nothing happened. And on Sunday, I had been to church with my wife and two small children and my mother who was visiting. And I was back home and they were upstairs getting ready for us to go out to lunch. And I thought, well, I was in the living room, I'll turn the TV on and see what's happening. And I turned it on, and as the picture was forming, but before it became visible, I could hear the sound. And they were saying, "He's been shot, he's been shot." And I thought, well, now what? And then the picture formed, and there was Oswald had just been shot by Ruby. So I saw that and walked to the foot of my stairway in my house, called up to my wife and said, I'm going to have to skip dinner because they've just shot Oswald and I have to go to Parkland to see what I can do to help. And she called down, she said, who is Oswald? And I said, he's the man that they say shot President Kennedy. Oh, she said, well, we'll see you later, she said. So I left and headed for Parkland, met Dr. Shires coming back from Parkland. He was back in town now. And we stopped our cars there on Beverly and stuck our heads out the window, and each one checked to see if the other one had just heard about Oswald, and we had. So he turned his car around and we raced back out to Parkland and got there just after Oswald had arrived. And we got out of our cars, ran into the emergency room, looked into trauma room 2, which is where they had Oswald. And it was a beehive of activity. The residents, the interns, and nurses in the emergency room were doing everything they could to resuscitate and get him ready for upstairs to the operating room to be explored. And he looked like he was at death's door when we looked in there. But we saw that was being taken care of, so we quickly went upstairs, Dr. Shires and I did, and changed into scrubs. And by the time we did that, they had Oswald upstairs on the operating room table, and Dr. Perry, who happened to be in the hospital, was there too, as was Dr. Ron Jones. So Dr. Jones, Dr. Shires, Dr. Perry, and I helped Dr. Shires do the exploration of Oswald's abdomen. And he had been resuscitated quite well then, had good blood pressure, and seemed to be doing out okay. And Dr. Shires rapidly explored his abdomen. In fact, someone told me that they had timed from when Oswald was shot downtown to when Dr. Shires made the incision, and it was something like just a little bit over 30 minutes from the time he was shot until the actual incision was being made in his abdomen. And Dr. Shires was able to get down through this massive hematoma that was in the back part of Oswald's abdomen and get clamps on both the aorta and the vena cava, because that's where he had been injured. When he was shot, when he saw Ruby advancing toward him, rather than continuing to walk directly toward the pistol that was being pointed at him, he understandably turned a bit reflexly so that his left side was presented to the weapon. And the bullet, when it was fired, instead of going straight through from the front to the back, where it might not have caused a fatal injury, instead went across the back part of his abdomen, coming in somewhere about here, and instead of straight through from the front, and injured both his aorta and his vena cava. And those are usually unsurvivable injuries, either one by itself, but much less both of them. Nevertheless, the way the blood clot had formed, he had not died instantly, as you might have imagined he would have, but had been able to survive to that point, to get explored. And in fact, the exploration went on for about 30 minutes after the incision was made, but then he arrested because he had had so much blood loss and shock that his heart had been damaged by that. Dr. Perry dropped out of the operating team and opened his left chest and began to massage his heart. And I dropped out, and Dr. Perry and I took turns massaging Oswald's heart. And initially, it seemed like it was beginning to come back and began to pulsate again, but then it stopped again or fibrillated again, and we never could, even though we massaged for, I think, about 25 or 30 minutes. It became apparent soon that I was not going to succeed, and so he was pronounced dead. And we went back out again to the area at the nurses' station where one of the deputy that was handcuffed to Oswald was sitting there waiting to see what was happening in the operating room. And so we talked to him, and he told Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter and I and Dr. Shires, he said, as soon as Oswald was shot, I got down on my hands and knees over him and put my face down in his, and I said, son, you're hurt real bad. would you like to say anything to me now? And he said Oswald opened his eyes wider then and looked up at him for a long time. I mean, a relatively long time, a few seconds, a few long seconds. And he said, I'll believe till the day I die that he was thinking that he was going to say something. But then after those few seconds, he shook his head like that, real wide, very definitively from side to side, closed his eyes, and that's the last time he ever opened them. So that was our experience with Oswald that Sunday following the Friday that the president was shot.
Do you remember any telephone calls coming into the operating room?
I don't, but one of the neurosurgery residents who was sitting out there by the nurses' station said that he heard that a call came in from the White House wanting to know what was the status of Oswald while he was on the operating table. But I just heard that hearsay about that.
Were there any officials, law enforcement officials, in the operating room with you?
No, but I learned something again recently. In fact, well, not recently, but maybe about a year and a half ago. Robert Groden called me one day. He's kind of made a career out of this, I think. And I've come to know him over the years. I've seen him several times and talked to him. He called me up and he said, I have something I'd like to show you. He said, are you busy? Could I come out and show it to you? And I said, yeah, I'd be glad to see whatever you had to show me. So he came out in a little bit. And what he had was some 35 millimeter old Kodachrome pictures that had been taken by someone in the operating room of all of us while we were operating on Oswald. And that was the first I'd ever been aware that any kind of pictures like that had been taken. And he had somehow or other, Robert Groden, had acquired this old roll of Kodachrome film. And the only thing he told me about it is that it had been found in the desk of a former assistant administrator at Parkland who was no longer working at Parkland, and someone was cleaning his desk out and found this roll of film. And somehow or other, Groden had acquired it. How, I don't know, and he wouldn't tell me. And so he knew enough about film processing and knew that this was an ancient roll of film. And he knew somebody in either Arizona or New Mexico who specially processed old film like this. And he got that film to them, and they developed it and showed pictures that were taken in the operating room from this roll of film. And he wanted me to look and see, was this us? And I looked at him, and yeah, that's me, and that's Dr. Perry, and that's Dr. Shires in the operating room while we were operating on Oswald.
You could see Oswald in the pictures?
Couldn't see Oswald, but I could see that it was all of us, were in the operating room. And I couldn't imagine, now who and why were they doing that?
Do you remember how many pictures you saw?
Several. And Groden said he was going to put them in a book he was writing. I don't think that has appeared to my knowledge yet.
No, I've not seen those photos.
Yeah, well, Groden showed them to me, and I think that must have been, like I said, maybe about a year and a half ago, something like that. Came out to my office and showed them to me.
It must have been a unique experience in retrospect for you. There you are with your hands literally on the heart of the man who may have killed the president you tried to save desperately 2 days earlier.
Right.
Have you ever thought about this unique position you were in, dealing with the accused assassin 48 hours later?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that, I've thought about that many times, and it's almost like if you wrote a story about it, it wouldn't be very believable. But another unbelievable thing, another coincidence that you might want to put in here at this point, is that several years after the assassination, and around the time I had seen the Zapruder film, I got a call one day from one of my surgeon friends at Presbyterian Hospital out here on Walnut Hill Lane, and I had a number of patients that I used to operate on at Presbyterian at that time. And he asked me, he said, "Are you coming out this afternoon to Presbyterian?" I said, "Yeah, I've got to come out and see some patients." And he said, "Well, I operated on this man today for gastric cancer, and he's not doing too well, and I think he needs to be re-explored. And would you help me scrub on him when you come out this evening?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll be glad to." So I got out there about maybe a couple hours later and walked into the operating room at Presbyterian. I asked the nurse on duty there, I said, "What room are we operating in?" And she said, "Oh, I think it's room 5 back there. Look on the scheduling board." So I walked back, looked at the scheduling board, and saw, yes, it was room 5, I think it was. And the name of the patient was Mr. A. Zapruder, the man who filmed the assassination of the president, and I operated on Mr. Zapruder and re-explored him for his possible complication after gastric surgery many years later. I got to know Mr. Zapruder reasonably well in the post-operative period, and I think it was one of his relatives. I can't remember whether it was a cousin or somebody, but neither he nor I ever said a word to one another about our involvement in this shooting of the president.
Do you think he knew who you
Oh,
were?
he knew who I was, I imagine. He was obviously a very intelligent man, and I knew who he was. But that's another, just like that,
Interesting.
seeing the president 2 years before, almost a Jungian synchronicity, that lives intersect like that in that way. And my wife, for that matter, had our 2 young children at the pediatrician's, Dr. Robert Moore's office on Turtle Creek on the day of the assassination. And as she was sitting in the waiting room, the nurse came out of Dr. Moore's office and said, "Oh, we just gotten word that President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy are coming by in their motorcade our office out here on Turtle Creek. And so everybody, if they want to see the president, come out and stand on the side of Turtle Creek, and they'll be coming by in just a short time." Sure enough, my wife took my daughter, who was a babe in arms at the time, and my 2-year-old son, and they went out and stood on a little rock ledge that was alongside of Turtle Creek at that time. All those big high-rises, it was long before any of them were built. But Dr. Moore's office was there. And so they stood there for a few moments, and in a little bit, here comes the motorcade, and they see this group of people standing there, and they slow down and drive slowly by them. And my wife said, "I could have leaned down and touched them," and then 20 minutes later, the president was shot downtown. So that was another odd familial coincidence that involved me, at least indirectly.
What memories do you have of talking to the Warren Commission and researchers and investigators?
Well, I was interviewed by Arlen Specter, he's the same age that I am, and at that time we were both just young whippersnappers, you might say, and he was a kind of a low-level interrogator for the Warren Commission. Nobody knew who he was at that time. And he interviewed me for the Warren Commission in the administrator's office at Parkland. And we talked in that interview for about 30 minutes. And so I met him then. And then it was interesting, when he was running for president, he came by. Dr. Perry was still alive at that time and had been out at other places for a long time in the interim, but had rejoined our faculty here. Well, we got a call one day from Dr. Wildenthal, who was the president of Southwestern Medical School, and he said, "I wondered if I could get you to come over to my office." Dr. Perry and I, he called each one of us individually, said, "Senator Specter is in town, and he has expressed a wish to meet with you and Dr. Perry." So anyway, we went over to Dr. Willenthal's office, and many years later, while Specter was running for president, we met and talked with him in Dr. Willenthal's office, and we reminisced about, that day.
Were you
So-
contacted by the House Select Committee in the 1970s?
No, I wasn't. I know that about that, and that they came to the conclusion that there was some kind of conspiracy. They didn't know what, but they decided that that's what happened. And of course, that's more congruent with my thinking about there being two shooters instead of one. And I don't know any details beyond that, but I didn't testify to them.
Now, the Assassination Records Review Board in the 90s.
I did talk to them, yes.
What do you remember from that experience?
Very little. They got all of us together in a kind of a summary meeting, Dr. Peters and Dr. Perry and I, and we kind of reviewed the bidding as they were shutting that down somewhere in the 90s. I can't remember. But that has only a kind of a dim impression in my mind as to what they did.
What about researchers, private investigators, book authors? Are there any that stand out in your mind?
Well, the one that stands out is this one I think I mentioned briefly to you, a book called My God, I'm Hit. And basically what they did, the two authors of this book both interviewed me directly or by telephone, and I told them essentially what I've told you here today. And then they didn't tell me about what their thesis was. Their thesis, that I later found out when they sent me a copy of this book and made a very peculiar request of me, I had showed them the bloody shirt that I had been wearing when I helped take care of President Kennedy. In fact, when we took care of President Kennedy, I didn't have time to change in the scrubs, and I was there taking care of him and standing at the head of the gurney in my suit. And so my suit was soaked in blood. And the next day, my wife took that bloody suit to Fishburne's Cleaners and had it cleaned. And the cleaner, in fact, asked her, "Are you going to have this suit cleaned?" And she said, "Yes, my husband only has two suits." And so she got it cleaned. But I kept the shirt that had bloodstains on it. And the people that wrote this book, their contention is that this was not Kennedy riding in the limousine, but that he was somehow a ringer who had been persuaded to substitute for Kennedy, not knowing that he's going to be shot, and that he is shot and then taken for treatment at Parkland, and that's who we were treating. And they wanted me to take this bloodstained shirt to a laboratory and have the DNA tested and prove that this was not Kennedy's blood. And they contend in this book that the actual President Kennedy sort of abdicated by a seeming assassination, and that he was instead secreted away for the rest of his life on an island in the Baltic Sea, period. That's the end of that strange story.
How did you respond to their request?
Well, they kept sending me letters wanting me to do that. I chose not to do that. I thought it was crazy. And in fact, they started sending me registered letters insisting that I do this. And I talked to one of my cousins here in Dallas who is a lawyer, and he said, "Well, let me have one of my associates write them a letter to cease and desist." And he did, and I haven't heard anything from him now for about a year or more.
You posed with that shirt in a very dramatic photograph that was in
D Magazine.
D Magazine.
Right.
What are your plans for that in the future? Where do you want that to end up?
I don't know. I haven't. I guess what my thoughts are that my son, who's my executor of my estate, probably will do whatever he chooses to do with that as other parts of my, estate.
Are your children interested in this subject?
Not that much. No more so than the average person would be, I guess.
Over the years, have you ever felt intimidated by any researchers? Has anyone ever threatened you or tried to get you to change your story?
No, I have heard other people say that they have heard that there have been. In fact, someone told me recently, may have been even after Dr. Perry died or right before he did, when I was commenting to them that he would never talk to me or anybody else about this. If, in fact, if you mentioned it, his face would cloud up and he would let you know that's not to be discussed, and you would move to another subject immediately. And he said, whoever was telling me this, and I can't remember who it was, said, well, they had heard that the reason that he might be doing that is that he had been threatened by someone if he ever said anything much one way or the other about it. Whether that really happened or not, I have no way of knowing.
I have read that Dr. Baxter sort of swore some of the doctors to secrecy. Do you remember that, or is there any details you can share about that?
Well, in all due respect to Dr. Baxter, he has some memories of that are not consistent with mine. Now, who's to say, well, maybe his memories are right and mine are wrong. It's a matter of opinion, but they're pretty bizarre, some of the memories.
Do you remember any officials at Parkland or any investigators or law enforcement or government officials ever telling you not to talk about this subject?
Nobody ever said a word to me about that. And I never got any threats. Nobody told me ever not to talk. Nothing.
You have been one of the more vocal of the physicians that was in Trauma Room 1. Have you ever turned down an interview request?
I don't think so. I feel like it's a matter of public information, that people have a right to, or the American public has a right to hear about. It's not something that I can conceal like it was some personal affair of mine. It's not that at all.
Apart from the possibility of being threatened, any idea why Dr. Perry and Dr. Clark and Dr. Jenkins so rarely talked about this subject?
I don't know. Now, I know Dr. Perry would probably refuse for whatever those reasons might be. As to the others, I don't really know. I can't say why. It seems that they would have, but I certainly have not sought, to be interviewed or to talk. It's been people calling me up or talking to me and would you come talk or would you come, be interviewed or whatever.
In later years, would you ever get together with your old colleagues and ever talk about this subject at all? Compare notes?
No. All the talking I've done has been in various, talks that I've given about this, like I said, to the library and to the Park Cities Historical Society, and I guess maybe through the years it's kind of become noised about that I was there and that I have talked to another group. Maybe they'll talk to this group, and so that's why I've been sort of singled out and saddled with that particular problem.
Charles Crenshaw, of course, wrote a book, and it was later republished, and he had a problem with the American Medical Association. What can you share with me about that?
The only thing I know real little about it, just kind of, again, hearsay, but the one kind of interesting thing that I know about it is that when he wrote that book, both Dr. Baxter and Dr. Perry had some rather uncomplimentary things to say about Dr. Crenshaw, even though Dr. Crenshaw and Dr. Baxter had known each other since early in their lives because they both were from Paris, Texas. So they knew one another very well, and of course they knew one another during Dr. Crenshaw's residency at Parkland. And Dr. Baxter made some uncomplimentary statements about Chuck making money off of this and that he thought that was bad. And this was published in the paper and around. And then Dr. Perry made a statement publicly that was published that, well, he doesn't think Dr. Crenshaw was even there. Well, of course, if he had asked me, I could have told him, yes, he was there because Crenshaw is the one who came and told me about it and escorted me down to the emergency room. Well, what happened as a result of those two uncomplimentary statements about Dr. Crenshaw by Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter is that he sued them for defamation of character. And he died, I think, before that was brought to a conclusion. Dr. Crenshaw died.
But he successfully sued the AMA for some statements they had made.
Did he successfully do that? I didn't know whether that had succeeded or not.
Have you read the book?
No, I've looked at it, but I haven't read it.
Any particular thoughts on some of the stories he shares about?
Well,
the fall
he
from
was
the
there and he was around, but I don't think he had did some of the things he said he did. I think he said he helped place the president in his coffin. I don't know that he didn't, but I kind of wonder if that really happened or not. I don't know.
Over the years, a few others have shared stories similar to what you shared about being in the room during the last rites and seeing Jackie do the ring exchange. The ones that come to mind immediately are Aubrey Reich and Dr.
Salyer.
Kenneth Salyer.
Hmm.
Do you recall either of those gentlemen being in the room?
I don't remember them being in the room, but again, I was so honed in on what was directly in front of me that Father Huber was doing that I wasn't looking around to see who else was there, you know.
Have you ever, and you don't have to name
If anybody.
names, but have you ever encountered an individual who has shared a story about Parkland or about the treatment of the president or Oswald that you know definitely is not true, that they were making that up?
No, I don't know that I've run across anybody that I think was, you know, fabricating anything. Whether they were or not, that might have happened, but I don't know of anything like that.
You mentioned earlier that some of the recent reading you've been doing, you've looked into eyewitness accounts and things like that, and you suggested that maybe we should talk about that a little bit.
Right, particularly another book that I have here is called Beyond the Fence Line. The eyewitness account of Ed Hoffman and the murder of President Kennedy. And then this is a picture of Mr. Hoffman on the back of that book. And that's...
Let me get you to pause here just one. All right, sir. I cleared off some space on my hard drive, and you were going to share with me about Ed Hoffman's book.
Okay, you got
Yes.
this, right, okay. Well, to put that in a context, about 2 years ago in November, I got a call one day from a lady who said she was the secretary of a group called the Lancers Society. And I said, well, who is that? And she said, well, it's a group of people who are interested in the assassination. And since I think she said about 1994, they have met each year, usually at the Adolphus Hotel downtown, and had a couple of days meeting in which they would present different talks about people's ideas about the assassination and various aspects of it. And she wanted to invite me to their meeting. And I said, oh, I don't have to speak, do I? No, you don't. We just like to have you come down to the meeting. Well, okay. I didn't have anything better to do, and unfortunately, I just had to admit my wife to a nursing home for an Alzheimer's problem that she had. So I said, well, I'll come. And so I went down that Saturday evening to the Adolphus Hotel, and I thought, well, this is going to be a group of probably 12 or 14, maybe kind of strange people who were sitting around wanting to talk to that. And I walked into the Adolphus and I asked the concierge, I said, where is the group called the Lancers? Where are they meeting? Oh, they're in the big banquet room upstairs. So I walked up into that big banquet hall just to the left of the desk in the Adolphus, and there must have been 300 or 400 people in there, big group of people. And as I was heading toward that area, I saw these two people who wrote this book. I saw two men approaching me who obviously had recognized who I was. And they came up to me and introduced themselves, the authors of this book. And it seems that they are two high school history teachers who had gotten interested in this and in Mr. Hoffman's story. And in fact, I remember at the time of the assassination having seen some oblique things on television about Mr. Hoffman and his story at that time. Well, they had gotten interested in this and had come down here and had investigated Mr. Hoffman's story, and on that investigation, they had based this book. And they came to the conclusion that Mr. Hoffman had indeed, with everything they had checked out, seen what he said he saw, only his story had been discounted. In fact, just put aside as just the babblings of some not very bright individuals, you know. And of course, at that time, people who were deaf mutes were referred to generally as deaf and dumb, with emphasis on the dumb. And a lot of people thought that they were just not very intelligent. So anyway, they said, we would like you to sit with us at our table in here at the banquet. And they ushered me in, and as I came in, sat down at their table, I saw there was a man, an older man and woman, sitting with their backs to me, and then there was a younger lady sitting across from them, and I sat down, and I saw, when I sat down, I saw Mr. Hoffman, and I remembered him from having seen him on television. I said, "Oh, I know you," and stuck my hand out. And anyway, this was his daughter sitting across the table from us, and she interpreted the sign language between me and Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Hoffman's wife, who was sitting there next to him, who's also a deaf mute. They had met at the Deaf School for the Deaf in Austin many years ago and married. Well, I sat there and listened to his story again through him and his daughter, as well as through these two authors. And then they gave me a copy of this book, and they made me believe pretty strongly that they too had made a good story for Mr. Hoffman, having seen what he saw. And that's further confirmed in this book that just fell off on the floor, The Legacy of Secrecy, by comments there from the National Archives of this Mr. What's his name, Bowers, in the railroad tower behind the picket fence, who also saw people behind the picket fence, as did Mr. Hoffman, when he parked or got pulled off the side of the road and on Stemmons as the motorcade was coming down toward the triple underpass, and he saw this man in this posed shot lift the rifle up onto the fence and fire the shot, and saw it hit President Kennedy in the head. And at that time, there was no vegetation and undergrowth there that would obscure the vision from that site like it would now. And so Mr. Hoffman saw men back there, saw them fire the shot. Mr. Bowers saw men back there. He didn't see them fire the shot, but he says in this book that he saw a flash of light and smoke coming from the area behind the picket fence. And then to further confirm that there was someone behind the picketed fence, at least indirectly, I've gotten two stories from people that were associated with that on the day of the assassination with the Dealey Plaza. One of them is a Mr. John Loving, who was one of two patrolmen, police patrolmen, who were in Dealey Plaza that day. And right after the president was shot, he and his partner jumped off their motorcycles, and as they saw this crowd running up behind the picket fence, they too thought they had heard something fired from behind the picket fence, and they went running around behind the fence carrying sawed-off shotguns. And they went behind there, and they didn't see anybody back there at that time. This was a couple of 3 minutes at least after the shot had been fired. But they walked farther back into that area, back where there was a coal car parked on a siding. And they walked along there, and they heard voices coming from one of these coal cars. And Mr. Loving said that they then climbed up on the car, looked down into it, and at one end there were some card-carrying hobos. Apparently it was their voices they had heard, but at the other end there were three men in business suits, or in regular, not hobo clothing, but regular civilian clothes. And so they had them come down, wave their shotguns at them, and took them across to the sheriff's office here, turned them over to some deputies that were there. And Mr. Loving says he thinks there were two FBI men there, happened to be there at that time. And to their amazement, after the briefest of questioning, these officers in the sheriff's office let these three men go. And I remembered seeing pictures in the paper then of the three tramps that were being brought out from behind. And so I've had an opportunity to get to know Mr. Loving. And the way I got to know him, he heard one of my talks one time. And the way that talk came about and the way I met Mr. Loving is that I was talking to a group of people at the home of one of my professor friends at the medical school who had asked me to come to his home and talk to a group of people that he knew about this experience. And I had, and this was largely a group of people who were from his Sunday school class, one of whom was Mr. Loving. And so afterwards, got to know him, and we came down one day, in fact, and walked around Dealey Plaza. And he told me this story about trapping these men and taking them across. And he doesn't believe Mr. Hoffman's story. He doesn't think Mr. Hoffman could have seen what he saw. I don't agree with Mr. Loving on that. I think Mr. Hoffman did see it, but for some reason, Mr. Loving thinks he couldn't have seen that. But I'm convinced that he did.
Do you think you'll write your own book someday?
I don't think so. People have asked me that, but it would be a pretty thin book, and it pretty
You have so many interesting connections to this story, though.
Well, it is, but you know, it's a thumbnail sketch. All of these things are. And then I have one final thing that's even more unbelievable. And in fact, I tried to introduce this other source just a couple of weeks ago to Mr. Loving and compare their stories and get them to talk to me about it, because I knew that I had to talk down here, and I also knew that I've been scheduled again to talk about this next month at a meeting of the North American chapter of the American College of Surgeons. They've asked me to talk to that group about this. So I thought, well, I'll get Mr. Loving together with this other man that I have met recently, again through a member of a Sunday school class. And his name is Mr. Jack Shaw. Mr. Shaw still lives out in East Dallas, and I called him and invited him to come to meet with me with Mr. Loving at La Madeleine out on Preston about 2 weeks ago. Well, Mr. Loving showed up, but Mr. Shaw didn't at our meeting. So that kind of cast a little pall on my looking for further information and comparing notes here between these two. But the story I got from Mr. Shaw, he had heard my talk, and after my talk, he said, I want to talk to you if you would come to my house sometime, because I have some connections with this too that I think you should know about. And I said, well, okay. So about a week later, I called him up and said, would this be a convenient time to come out to your home? And he said, yes. And so I went out there and we talked for a couple of hours. And in brief, the story that Mr. Shaw told me, and I asked him if it's okay if I talk about this. And he said, yeah. In fact, he's in the process himself of writing a book about this. Mr. Shaw, back around, somewhere in the late 60s or not too long after the assassination, had organized a small church out in East Dallas and was the minister of that church. And one of the members of his congregation was a man and his wife who had a little boy. And anyway, he got to know them reasonably well in this small congregation. And one day he got a call from this man's wife. And he didn't tell me the man's name. And in fact, I asked him not to tell me because I'm not sure I want to know the name. anyway, he said his wife called him and said her husband was in the burn unit at Parkland, and that she wanted him to come out and talk to him because he was at death's door. In fact, he did die the next day after she called him and asked him to come out, which he did. And what had happened is this man had gotten this terrible burn that killed him. He had been doing something at a welding shop. And some of the witnesses at the welding shop had told this minister, Mr. Shaw, about what happened, that he had been working on this thing in the shop, and some guy came in to talk to him, nicely dressed man in a suit, and they had a brief conversation, and then the man went somewhere, maybe to the restroom or something, and the man in the suit continued standing there. And they thought maybe he had done something to what was going on with the welding equipment. And the reason they thought that is because when the man came back and resumed his activity with the welding equipment, it blew up and burned him severely, at which time he was taken to the Parkland Hospital burn unit. And at this point, his wife called the minister to come talk to this man, and he went out to talk to him, and when he came into his room where he was in the burn unit, his wife was standing against the wall, and the man said, he was still conscious and able to talk, he said, well, he said, Mr. Shaw, he said, I want you to know I've done some bad things in my life. And he began to talk in sort of general terms. And his wife interrupted and said, now, whatever his name was, you need to tell him about what we talked about. Well, the sense of that was this man told Mr. Shaw that he had been this man who had fired the bullet from behind the picket fence that had killed Kennedy. And he died the next day. This was a deathbed, if you will, confession to
Did he
this
share
minister.
any details about who hired him or anything like that?
Now, he may have to this Mr. Shaw. I don't know. And I didn't press him for that. And as I said, I actively told him I don't want to know that man's name. He knows it. But I told him, I said, I don't want to be privy to that information.
It's a very intense and dramatic subject that really wraps people into it, and it continues to fascinate people around the world who study this assassination.
Yeah. And this has just been within the last year.
I know Mr. Loving. I've done an oral history with him. And I'd be interested in talking with Mr. Shaw if it's something you might be able to set me up with him, or at least introduce me to him. That would be terrific.
Well, I could, I'd have to look him up and call him. In fact, I don't know if I have his. Let me look here right quick to see if he's on my list of people.
In the intro, let me ask you a question. Jack Ruby died at Parkland in 1967.
Right. I have his number here.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we can get that later.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, that'd be terrific. I'd love to get in touch with him and hear his story for one of these interviews.
Yeah.
Did you ever see or talk with Jack Ruby when he was at Parkland in late '66?
I saw him one time as I was leaving the operating room. He was being rolled in a bed going toward the operating room. That's the only time I ever laid eyes on him, and I never spoke to him.
Did you ever have any contact with Governor Connolly, either while he was there at Parkland or later in life?
Well, I helped operate on his leg, so that was the third party that I actually was involved in the surgery that afternoon. That's a kind of an interesting little story here. As I said, Dr. Shires was in Galveston at the Western Surgical meeting, and at the time, or right after the president was shot, he was out of the speakers area in the auditorium where they were listening to the speakers at the meeting, around the coffee pot. having a cup of coffee. And anyway, as he stood there, he said Dr. Charles Mayo from the Mayo Clinic came out and saw him, and he said, "Tom, did you hear what just happened in your city?" And Dr. Shire said, "No, what?" He said, "Well, they just shot and killed President Kennedy." Oh my goodness, you know, he had not heard of that. So he said, "I've got to be back up there." Well, they called the Galveston police. They came out, put him into a police car, tore at great speed up to the airfield, the military airfield at what's the name of that field down there? It's closed probably now, but they had an air base there outside Houston, between Houston and Galveston, put him into a Sabre jet and flew him to Love Field in a military pursuit, in a like I said, a Sabre jet, and deposited him at Love Field, where he then was sped out to Parkland and got here about 3 or so that afternoon after the assassination, just as Dr. Baxter and I and Dr. Gregory were about to explore Governor Connolly's wounds. The chest wound had already been taken care of. Dr. Gregory, our orthopedic surgeon, was about to explore Governor Connolly's wrist, or the bullet had gone through his chest, through his wrist, which was lying on his thigh, and then had gone through the wrist out into his upper thigh. So Dr. Gregory was exploring the wrist and doing whatever he needed to do for that. And Dr. Baxter and I were just about to explore the femoral artery and vein near this bullet wound in Governor Connolly's leg. So we were upstairs in the Parkland operating room doing that. And as we started to make the incision in Governor Connolly's leg, we looked up outside at the scrub sink, and Dr. Shires was busily scrubbing his hands and came in and helped us complete the exploration of Governor Connolly's thigh. And we didn't do something there that we should have done. Maybe taking a page out of all the old westerns where they got to get the bullet out, you know. Well, of course, with a bullet wound, that's not what you're doing. You're not trying to dig the bullet out. In fact, you usually don't do that because you may cause damage doing it. You simply try to correct and treat what injury the bullet did, like to major blood vessels. And that's what we were doing. We didn't try to find any fragments of the bullet. And other people have since then pointed out, gee, that's unfortunate that in this case you didn't try to retrieve some of the fragments of the bullet, which I suppose are still in Governor Connolly's leg in the cemetery somewhere.
There's always something.
Yeah.
We're almost 50 years past those events in 1963, and as you mentioned, you continue to talk about the subject, continue to read about the subject. Does it surprise you that there's still such international fascination with it?
It is a little surprising, and I don't pretend to understand, you know, what all the pressures are behind that, but I guess it's just, it's something, you know, I think that's still current even in a lot of people's minds about the assassination of President Lincoln. There's still a lot of unanswered questions about that nearly 150 or so years later, relating to whether Booth was really killed when he was supposedly shot or not, related to who was the mastermind behind the conspiracy that led to Lincoln, and that we still don't have answers to those questions.
You're an important part of this subject. I've been reading about the Kennedy assassination my entire life, and I've known your name for many, many, many years. 100 years from now, how do you want to be remembered? What do you think Robert McClelland's legacy is in this subject?
Well, I hope it would be as a kind of a non-involved, rational, I hope, rational observer without any particular axe to grind, but just saying what I, as a outside observer, have seen, as I said a moment ago, a worm's eye view of this. Of a very thing that's very interesting because of the nature of the subject, and interesting to me because of that, as well as just a general interest that I've always had in all aspects of history, you know.
Is there anything else you can think of that we haven't covered?
I don't think of anything else. I think those are the major portions of things that I had anything directly or indirectly to do with.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is your second time to sit down with us, and we appreciate you taking the time both times to participate in our oral history project. And if something else comes up, or if you discover more in your readings and research, we'll have you back again and we'll do another follow-up.
Well, I appreciate the getting to talk with you, and it's been I think, a very interesting experience for me to converse with you about this.
And interesting for me as well, sir, and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're coming back for a little addendum. You and I have been sitting here chatting for a couple minutes, and there was a documentary that the Discovery Channel produced a couple years ago called Inside the Target Car, where they recreated the shot to the president's head, and you had some comments on that.
Right. I saw that just very recently when it was rerun, and I was intrigued by it for obvious reasons, I think, and I was hopeful that they might come to a somewhat different conclusion, or a very different conclusion than they did, so that hopefully it would be consistent with what I saw from my angle. But it didn't do that. It showed, first of all, that a bullet fired from into this replicated skull, which was apparently set up very nicely to totally reproduce the character of a skull bone and then of the brain within it and whatnot. I thought that was extremely well done. And then when they fired the bullet from the same angle and whatnot from the school book depository into the back of the president's head, that was, okay. Although that was not really where I think the bullet hit. I think from the school book depository, that one went through the back and came out the neck. And then the one that killed him came from the front and went tangentially in the front and out this huge hole in the back. And then they concluded this Discovery Channel program by showing then the bullet being fired from where the picket fence would have been. And when the bullet hit the replicated skull, it totally blew it apart. And so the conclusion was stated at that time, well, this indicates that the bullet, I can't remember whether it said it could not or is unlikely to have come from the picket fence, because it would have destroyed the skull, and it obviously didn't do that. Well, no, it didn't do that. But I don't think that just because it destroyed that replicated skull, first of all, we don't really know, and no, they didn't make comments about whether the bullet that had been fired from the picket fence, the actual picket fence that the assassin was behind, in contrast to the bullet fired by this person in this Discovery Channel program, maybe it was not a caliber of bullet that would have destroyed the skull. No comment was made about that. Well, we know it didn't, and it's conceivable to me, although I'm certainly no gun or ballistics expert, that a bullet fired from the picket fence could have gone in the skull here and blown out the back, creating this huge hole in the back without totally blowing the skull apart. I mean, that would take really something like a grenade launcher or something to blow the skull completely apart with just a rifle bullet. And so I found that difficult to believe. Maybe it still might be true. That's just my view of it.
Okay. You also mentioned a very well-known documentary earlier by Nigel Turner, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. You participated in that?
Yes, they interviewed me for that.
Do you have any memories of that experience talking with Nigel?
Not much. It was pretty much like, the interview that you and I have had, although I think we've had a more extensive interview than I had with him. But it was pretty much me telling the story at that time. I hadn't added on all of these additional things that have come to me since then. But it was pretty much otherwise the same kind of interview.
What about the end result of his documentary where he presents the...
I'm a little bit iffy on some of the conclusions that they came to. I thought it was interesting about, as I recall the story, in order to kind of cover their tracks, the mafia that he said was, like we mentioned about Carlos Marcello, was involved in this, that they decided that they were going to hire somebody out of the country. And they phoned somebody in Marseille, and they suggested that they hire 3 assassins from the Corsican mafia. And that they then flew to Mexico City and drove up to Dallas from Mexico City, where they took their stations behind the picket fence and fired the bullet that killed the president. Now, that doesn't jibe with, for instance, Mr. Shaw's story about having gotten a deathbed confession from, this gentleman that he claims gave him that. So that's a little bit iffy. That doesn't quite fit together. And then the other thing, what was it? There was something else relating to those men that might have fired that bullet. Oh, the 3 tramps. The further corroboration that they were not just innocent people who happened to be hunkered down in a coal car right after the time the president had been. And I think Mr. Shaw probably, not Mr. Shaw, but Mr. Loving might have mentioned this to you, that one of these 3 people was Woody Harrelson's father, who subsequently was convicted of ambushing a federal judge in San Antonio. So he was a known assassin, and must be embarrassing to Woody Harrelson, I guess. And then one of the other men that Mr. Loving told me about, that he was a mafia assassin, and that he was sent to Tyler, Texas to kill somebody, only they got the drop on him and they killed him instead. And Mr. Loving told me when we met at La Madeleine that he thought that probably that was a setup, that the man that was supposedly to be the killer had been set up by somebody else in the mafia to be killed by the man he ostensibly was going to kill in Tyler. In any event, these 2 men of these 3 that were supposedly just innocent bystanders that were released turned out later to have been clearly shown to be assassins.
What about Oliver Stone and his movie? Did you ever speak with him or any of his people?
I didn't speak with him, but he had me. I'm the last person listed on the cast of characters, underlined characters. And supposedly I was on the stand at a trial that never took place in New Orleans about Clay Shaw. And he had me testifying there to Kevin Costner. In fact, I think Grodin had something to do with that, he told me.
He was an advisor,
Yeah.
consultant.
But I never talked to Oliver Stone directly myself. And where he got that, and that's another little fillip on this story of mine, about this Shaw thing, that goes back to the district attorney in New Orleans. What was his name?
Jim Garrison.
Jim Garrison, who was also in Stone's movie, played the judge, as I recall, in Stone's movie. Anyway, Mr. Garrison saw my written testimony that appeared in the Warren Commission thing for the New York Times, that we had written, that I told you about, that we were handed out these pads that we wrote out our immediate impressions. Well, one of my immediate and wrong impressions was I attribute to something that Dr. Jenkins said as I came in the room where President Kennedy was. And what that was that Dr. Jenkins said as he sat there on the stool pressing the bag to breathe for the president, his hands were busy, so he couldn't point to anything. And as I came in, he nodded his head toward what I took to be the left temple of the president. His president's head was just bloody all over. And Dr. Jenkins said, "Bob, there's a wound," and he kind of inclined his head since his hands were occupied, to what I took to be the president's left temple. And he said, "Bob, there's a wound there." And I interpreted there to be the left temple. And then when I saw this huge wound, I thought, well, this was probably the exit wound that Dr. Jenkins pointed out to me that blew out this hole in the back of the president's head. And I wrote that in the introductory remarks of my comment that I made and gave to those Secret Service men. And I later, when I found out the whole story, knew that that was not right. In fact, Dr. Jenkins said, "No, I didn't mean to say that there was a left, temple wound." Okay, but he also said that it wasn't cerebellum, and when it was, and I knew it was. But about, it must have been 5 or 6 years after the assassination, I was leaving for work one morning just as my little daughter was going off to school in the first grade, and she answered the phone. And as I was heading for my car, she said, "Daddy, just a minute. Some man wants to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." And so I went and I said, "Hello." And they said, "Is this Dr. McClelland?" This big, important sounding voice. "Yes, well, this is so-and-so. And Mr. Garrison's office is the district attorney in New Orleans." And anyway, he said, "We're about to go to trial, and we wanted to speak to you. We think we would like to have you come to New Orleans and testify in this trial." And he said again in this big, deep, important voice, said, "We're assuming, Mr. Garrison is assuming that what you stated in this thing you'd written out about this left temple wound, that you still, would testify to that." And I said, "No, I wouldn't." And so his voice went up an octave. "He wouldn't, I said, "No." And I told him, what had happened and what later and anyway, he had said they were going to subpoena me and whatnot. Anyway, they never did. That was the end of my part in that. And then, of course, that trial, which was shown in the movie, never took place. There was no trial about Mr. Shaw and the possible involvement in that. But they were apparently hooking a good bit of what they were going to bring out in that trial on this wound in the left temple that I had written about.
One last question. There's a story that Jackie Kennedy came into the trauma room and she had a piece of the president's skull or brain tissue.
Brain.
And she gave it to Dr. Jenkins.
That's right.
And
he told me about that. Yeah, he I can't remember exactly when, but right around that time, maybe right afterwards or something, but he pointed out, he made the statement that this was one of the things that horrified him about the whole thing, was that when she first came into the room after they had just rolled the president in, she was holding, I think he said in her right hand, a large piece of his cerebrum and handed it to him. And, what could he do but take it from her? And he did. But apparently it was as she was climbing out, on the rear of the limousine, I guess that's what she retrieved and had continued to grip it in her hand all the way out to the hospital. And when she walked in from behind the president, she handed him that piece of brain, large piece of brain.
What happened to that? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. In fact, I have read another interesting thing about this whole thing, what I've read about. I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, the official autopsy report. The autopsy report always gives the weight of the brain, which they take out and weigh, and it was given as something like 3,000 grams, which is the weight of a normal intact brain. Well, I knew that wasn't right because at least half, maybe more than half, of the right part of his brain was gone along with the cerebellum. So it couldn't have weighed 3,000 some odd grams, but that's the way it's stated in the official autopsy report, that it weighed 3,000, and the brain disappeared. That no one knows. It's kind of like Einstein's brain disappeared for a while. but they found it later. But they've never found the remnants of Kennedy's brain, which of course is a template for the bullet fragments that might be in the brain that might implicate the fact that there were two shooters rather than one, or two weapons maybe rather than one.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think that's sort of dredged the last
That'll do it for today.
bit of things out of
All right.
yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Okay.